the button, Gary.
Is this a podcast?
Your mother today.
Suddenly it was time to start. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be in the world. I don't know why I missed that. Just missed time going by, the next march towards the grave, and all that sort of thing. Well, RID. Can we get rid of RID? RID is really becoming a thing. People in America believe that it's going to get another extension and get pushed back, and they really won't have to comply. So lots of people saying that now. That rumour's sort of coming up to set in and kind of set hold, whatever the phrase is. And the UK, I mean, announced, as we discussed last week, that it's doing it. So
we've got some feedback. I think it might be your speaker. Can you just mute for a second?
He's not talking, so he is mute.
Yeah, it's Richard. It was Richard. It was him.
Oh, there's an echo, says Ian. Hello, Ian. Come and join us. I wonder which exotic hotel Ian's in today. Yeah, no, Ridge, you want to start on that FAA video, Bruce? The man's not arrived.
What video?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, wasn't that great? Actually, go and look at the comments on that video. It is very apparent that the FAA has a problem on its hands. People are not happy with what RID is turning into, and there is going to be a very high level of non-compliance. And it's very hard to regulate by consent if you don't get consent. And it looks like certainly one component of the community is not going to comply in any way, shape, or form because they just don't like it.
But obviously, the UTMs love it, and they've lined up and can't wait. And RID is going to make everything so much easier for Richard and Altitude Angel. It must be your bestest favoritist thing, Richard.
Can't wait.
There we go. Good. I thought you'd come up with some sort of comment like that. But in the big scheme of things, will it help you, do you think? Can't you comment because you're actually talking to the CAA about it?
No, I mean we're quite open about these things. Remote ID is another data input. It deals mainly, and in fact almost entirely and exclusively with cooperative traffic, right? So you have to cooperate with the standard in order for us to be able to receive that data, whether it's the broadcast variant or the networked variant. You have to be cooperative. Our job is to find people in the airspace who aren't necessarily cooperative from a point of view that they're working with Altitude Angel, right? So we're not necessarily breaking traffic down into those who are flying within the rules or not. It's who wants a service from us. So that's how we look at cooperative versus non-cooperative. And in that regard, the vast majority of the world is non-cooperative. Doesn't mean they don't have a right to be there. But remote ID is of limited value to us if we're looking for people that shouldn't be there, right? Or perhaps are in the way of an aircraft that's trying to go beyond line of sight over a long distance. So again, we kind of lump this in the same box as, yeah, it's great. It's potentially useful, but it's just a tool that's useful. ADSB is a tool and it has some utility. Remote ID has some utility. It has some critical flaws and some critical errors as well, right? From our perspective, and particularly in the UK and across Europe, we value privacy very, very strongly. Remote ID doesn't particularly do very well when you stack it up against things like that wonderful piece of EU legislation known as the GDPR. So when it comes to our implementation of remote ID, we conform with that standard, but we also do sort of privacy enhancing things. For instance, we assign operators random identifiers that change. We assign flights a different identifier every time the flight begins. And that actually, it's a direct learning from the old kind of ADSB days, right? In the UK, we used to have royalty flying around in air ambulances, and the paparazzi used to get used to the tail number, and they used to try and follow where a certain prince was going to be operating the air ambulance, because who doesn't want to see a picture of a prince rescuing someone from an air ambulance? And of course, they would then turn off the broadcast ID. Well, of course, we don't want to replicate that on a potentially more invasive scale, right? Because obviously remote ID, part of the standard is where is the pilot, where is the person versus where is the drone. So yeah, we're adding our own spin to that. But yes, are we tooling up to receive those inputs? Sure. Do we have our own broadcast receivers going in across the Skyway network? Yes. And that's part of our blueprint going forwards, because we'll grab the data that's being broadcast, but we get far higher data from people that want a service from us, right? They're or a far higher resolution, much better knowledge about where it's been broadcast from. We can do things like verify the message authenticity, all the wonderful things that the sort of ASTM standard doesn't particularly help with. But there we go. It's a modern equivalent of ADS-B. Make of that what you will.
So will you be logging the data in the way that the US is planning to log its data?
Well, I think the interesting thing is it depends on the implementation of the state, right? And as you saw probably recently this week, the UK CAA have sort of got an RFI out, which they've split into two. There's an RFI that some people can sort of easily get hold of. And there's another part of that RFI which has to do with something called the Master Data Hub, which is purchased, is sort of announced through a different procurement channel for the CAA. Reading between the lines, there's probably going to be some form of requirement to share what you receive. But again, the question will be, what about people that are spending hundreds of thousands building their own sensor networks? How do you compel those people to release information to the state or to other sources? Because again, we do this as a commercial entity, right? Not out of the goodness of our heart. So we have to really understand, how is that going to work, and how is that architecture going to protect the privacy of the data that people are, or we're collecting and storing in good faith, and people might not necessarily have the same belief or the same understanding of how the CAA system works. So the answer to that, Bruce, is it depends. I think it all remains to be seen. But certainly our current implementation is this stays within our boundary because we have good control over that. We understand it, and we have our own privacy standards on that.
Yeah, I'll just mute because you echo. That's good. Yeah. So it's not a matter of whether you're going to make it available or not. It's, are you going to store it historically so that if it is requested by the courts or whatever, they can go back through that data, or is it simply real-time stuff, and once you've used it, it is disposed of? That's the key factor.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we store telemetry actually for a reasonable amount of time, at a minimum sort of 90 days usually, but that's because it's stored and associated in the account of the person that transmitted it, so they can go back and they can see their records. Arguably, we could be in receipt of a warrant or something that asks us to do that, but we have a pretty robust history of defending, or not really defending, sorry, but sort of asking police forces, etc., jurisdictions around the world to go away and clarify their requests to make it more conformant with the actual legal instrument they're making the request under. So a good example is we don't sort of participate in fishing expeditions. We've had people come to us before, certainly in the UK, forces have come to us in good faith, but really barking up the wrong tree because they say, hey, we think there was a drone operating in this area sometime between Monday and July, and we would like you guys to turn over all of your flight records, to which we politely turn around and say, I'm sorry, you can't compel us to do that. You have to provide a reasonably specific request, and you have to have a reasonable police need to do that. And in our justification, that doesn't meet that. Here's our policy on this. If you don't agree, we can happily go to court, but I don't think a judge is going to agree with you. So, when it comes to remote ID, that will come in through what we call our surveillance pipeline. And it's not as nefarious as it sounds. We just have two pipelines in the company. One is telemetry, which is stuff that people willingly give us. And, they use to, maybe they integrate it into Mission Planner or their ground station, and we get that really high resolution data. Surveillance is stuff that we sense. So it's something we might receive on ADS-B. It might be a specific counter drone system. All of that data goes in, and then it gets archived and stored. It's stored and archived for analytical purposes and also for risk assessment. If we see an area that's continuously supremely high traffic, we'll probably bend the skyway around it, right? So that we don't keep going there. But it does raise an interesting question about what do we do with the association of it? We're still in the rollout phase for remote ID on Skyway. So it's entirely possible for us to anonymize the location pings at the point that we store it long-term, for instance. So there's a duration where we need to have some kind of association with it so that we can tie it together. But after that, we have no legitimate interest in storing it associated to, Bruce at 123 Cherry Tree Lane. So I think, again, we'll have to comply with whatever the law is, but we'll have to see where we go with that.
How dare you give away my address? But the thing is, though, that if you're going to take the data packets, they're anonymized anyway, aren't they? There's no one's name and address in the data packet. It's referred back through the database, the registration database. So you'll be deleting that reference number that would identify them with the person or identify that packet with the person that was operating the drone.
Yeah, the piece that's interesting is, of course, we can query, UTM companies can query that registration database. There are various different proposals for how that works. Part of our push, actually, it might sound slightly odd and contrary to what we'd like to do, but it would be very useful for a UTM company to be able to query the identity of a signal that it's receiving, so that we can do a degree of, verification. If you're telling us that your broadcast signal is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we see that, it would be very useful to be able to fuse those data points together, right? And likewise, if we don't recognize a number, we know that that's a service which is on a sort of semi-cooperative channel, but not someone that we can reach out to if we need to give them an avoidance instruction or something. So how we do that association has still got to be worked out in that implementation phase. But you're right, there is a degree of anonymity there. But of course, if you're in the master data hub, then you can decrypt all of those things. Well, not decrypt, it's not encrypted, sorry, but you can associate those reference numbers together. And I'm not entirely a big fan of states having master keys to big registration databases. There are a few that are in existence that I think as citizens we all put up with, but they tend to have been baked in over decades, potentially. A brand new system that's born to live on the internet, I think, is fairly new for a lot of different central purchasing agencies and governments. And that I find a little bit more concerning, that it might be operated by an agency which has never had to do this or procure a service like that. Or maybe it's hiring a consultancy firm that's never done this type of thing before. So I think we should all be a little bit concerned and asking the right kind of privacy and security questions around those.
What does concern me in what you said was alluding to the fact that you'd had a request from the police that weren't entirely appropriate in what they were asking, because for you to be asked that, to an angel to be asked that, you obviously dealt with that responsibly. But I fear if the CAA were on the receiving end of that, they'd likely just say, well, here you go. So if they're holding RID data, which is when we were talking about the network ID, it would worry me a bit that the CAA maybe not be quite as robust with the privacy as you'd expect. Because it's really like when you ask for data, like the telecoms networks and stuff, they would cooperate with the police. I think there was legal bits put in place for 6 months or 12 months. But even then, if you're going back further, and I suspect even with that, there was a process. I know so I worked in telecoms for a while. I know when the police were requesting stuff, there was a proper process to go through. So yeah, it would concern me a little bit, especially the way we've seen CAA being sort of less than transparent on some of the freedom of informations in the past.
Yeah, you'd like to hope that the process is robust between government agencies. I think just because you are part of the government doesn't mean that you just get to share all of that information. But I won't profess to understand the various different legislative instruments that are being put in place behind these systems. But I, for one, if I was flying around and I was broadcasting my identity like a good compliant drone operator, I would like to know that whoever is receiving that, or whoever's in receipt of the ability to match that broadcast identifier up with my home address or my other records, etc., that they'll take steps to protect that. I don't think the DVLA can just request information off the council where I am, and so they can marry all this up. I think there is a process, but I think aviation just confuses law enforcement a little bit more, right? It's new for, I'll say new, but it's relatively new for traditional enforcement channels, frontline officers, etc., to have to think about aviation. And I think it's also new for people in aviation agencies generally to have to deal with a traditional quote unquote Bobby on the beat, right? Because these two agencies have never had a legitimate need to interact before. So they don't really have policies, I think, that are as robust potentially as they could be.
Yes. Yeah, you're probably right. And now this Master Data Hub looks down to read it. Were you actually allowed to tell us about that?
I don't really know. We know very little about it. It's still in the RFI stage. But if I was being brutally summaristic of what I'd seen, then it looks like the Master Data Hub is basically just a procurement for a very large data store of some kind, analytical
it's not been released under a sort of procurement channel that a company like Altitude Angel could probably go for, or would actually be interested in, to be honest, because it looks like it's targeted at some big, computer consultancy firm that does massive cloud deployments just for fun, for storing SQL databases and reports and all of these really old-fashioned ways of reporting. I think if you put that together with the other procurement that they're currently doing, then you can kind of see where they might want to end up storing the records, and maybe that goes a little bit towards Ian's question around, how long are you going to store this stuff for, and what are you going to do with it? What can you do with it even, I think, is an interesting one. But again, the reality is there's very little detail at the moment. It looks like it's RFI stage, but it is being pushed very quickly. The Master Data Hub and the sort of procurement on remote ID seems to be going lightning quick. I think they're even talking about an October implementation, which is really fast.
Really?
So, yeah, and not that I'm cynical at all, but certain parts of it look like there's an element of cut and paste from other people's blog posts and public elements. So hopefully the CAA will do a diligent process, and they'll thoroughly research and look into the various different pros and cons of different systems, rather than proceed with an opinion, and just kind of go from there. But there's a lot in remote ID, but equally there's a lot in remote ID that a company like Altitude Angel doesn't really get concerned with. We need an identifier, and we assign one to every pilot anyway, right? So we already have an absolutely enormous registration database. It's just not in the purview of the state, and I think that's probably where there is an element of this system needing to be, or wanting to be.
Do you think you'll be forced to be a member of this Master Data Hub?
I don't know. We'll have to cross that bridge if we come to it, and of course we'll need to put up a relatively high bar, I think, because I think the bar should be high when we're dealing with people's privacy. I also understand the safety argument, but one doesn't negate the other. Just because you want to value your privacy doesn't mean you can't be safe, and equally, just because you really want to be safe doesn't mean you have to give up all your privacy. We should be having these robust debates, but I think we should also not be just defaulting into broad personal information sharing, because I think that's the kind of thing, if we still were part of the European Commission, there would be some concerns about. I also think the data protection officers in the UK, the Data Protection Act, would preclude a lot of the stuff that's kind of being mooted. But again, it comes down to devil's in the detail, right? It depends what people actually want to do with it, but we'll have to see.
Well, that speaks a little bit to, well, what do they actually want to do to it, and how will this improve safety? How will this make it different?
I don't know if it's a safety question, to be honest. I mean, I've been in a lot of different forums now, and I used to think that maybe this was supposed to be, or maybe it was being framed as a part of the safety mandate or the safety concept. I guess you could make an argument that if everything is broadcasting, then that's sort of safer than nothing broadcasting. But again, the more things that broadcast, the more noise there is generally, because you don't really learn a lot, because you end up caring less and less about the people that are broadcasting and more about the people that aren't. So the question then becomes, what do you actually anticipate people doing when they have access to this remote ID data? It's a big question for us, right? There are concepts like transponder mandatory zones, etc. I mean, they're being touted as potentially a great solution for beyond line of sight and de-risking those flights. But again, we always come back to this. It's great that you called it a transponder mandatory zone, but it doesn't mean that someone won't be there that doesn't have one, or it's malfunctioned. And I don't care about the people in the transponder mandatory zone that have one. In fact, I don't care where they are as long as they have one, right? It's where you are if you don't have one, and what are we supposed to do with that? Like, does our liability as a company, for instance, does it stop if we crash into a drone that's in a TMA or a TMZ and it doesn't have a transponder on it? And what if it does, but we just didn't receive it because there was just one of these things to do with radio interference, which occurs all the time. So what's it for? I don't think there is a broad understanding of the reason behind the mandate and the push to go so hard towards remote ID. And I think that should make not necessarily people nervous, but people should be questioning this more. And I think that questioning should first and foremost be coming from our aviation authorities, because their job really is safety, right? Or at least that's my understanding of it. I won't profess to be an absolute expert in the etymology of aviation, but that's traditionally what a civil aviation authority has done, right? It's kept everyone safe, and now it's sort of straying into what, security as well. And now it's straddling both of these, and I think it's grasping with a whole bunch of technical concepts that your traditional, aviation authority has never really had to worry about. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting one. Will we? We get asked a lot actually, and we've had a lot of individual companies in the UK approach us and say, hey, will you guys submit to the RFI? Will you bid? And yeah, of course we will, because we want to make sure it's done properly. And we want to make sure it's done in a way that is fair and it's transparent, and that it is also audited in its access and its use, etc. Because I think that is also a protection which could be left out of the final procurement, right?
God, it's frightening. It's frightening. It's all frightening.
One point. Can I jump in for a second? There's one concern is I feel at times that we kind of chase the FAA and say, well, if the FAA is doing this, it must be a good idea. Let's leave it and do it straight after. Where I think the FAA is, going to be finding that, remote ID. I mean, they've clearly not thought enough about some of the issues like privacy. So, I feel that we shouldn't be rushing in after them, because they could well make mistakes. And we know already 240 pounds came about with the FAA, and it wasn't scientific. It was just, it was more political. It was numbers plucked out of the air, where it set up the entire drone industry around numbers. And it was all just from the assumption that the FAA then were using just the appropriate science. I think at times, while we know they do the good stuff with Ashore on the likes now, we still need to be a little bit cautious about saying that's definitely a good idea. Wait until things pan out and people, so let's see the issues when it's actually there and operating, before we've jumped in and copied it and realized we've repeated a load of the same mistakes.
Yeah, well, I think there's. Oh, sorry, I was just going to jump in and say, I think we see this a lot. We see a lot of so much discussion, right, between regulators and various different agencies. They get all excited about various topics, and they convene these big international forums, and then they have sort of regional forums, and they all get really excited, and everyone goes away and shakes hands and signs declarations and pats themselves on the back for basically just agreeing that someone's got to move first, and then someone does, and it could be a randomer in that group, but someone does. And everyone goes, oh, that's clearly the way forwards, because they've done a bit of work that we perhaps didn't want to do, so we'll just blame them. And, although one country doesn't sort of say, create diplomatic industries, oh, yeah, it was the Americans' fault, but it's much easier to point at something else, right? And it's much harder to be the first mover. And I think that's where you see, whether you like the FAA or you don't, they're innovating a little bit more quickly than other regulators, right? And I use that with a small I, but they're moving and they're doing stuff, and they're gonna create waves, and they're gonna get stuff wrong. But I am also of the ilk that actually the longer we do this, the more I realise that it's potentially more damaging to do nothing at all. And you could argue that there are plenty of states, member states, UK potentially in that mix too. Choosing my words very carefully. Where we've just stood still for pretty much approaching a decade, right?
I was going to say a decade.
And I sit in forums that are, some of them are very UK centric, some of them are very sort of European centric, and we're still publishing roadmaps that talk about BV loss at scale, maybe by 2026, maybe by 2027, and everyone goes, oh hey, we're only just starting now, and it's like no. We're not, right? We're almost a decade in. You might be starting now, but the industry is still hurting. Innovation is still hurting. Investment is still held up. We need people to actually listen and start acting, and that's really challenging to do.
I see Dave Pankhurst from BT was all over that come on Britain, get your ass into gear effort. I don't think that's exactly what it said in the press release, but it effectively was that. But I wonder who who will actually bother to listen? And especially with the political turmoil that's happening over there at the minute, I think that little effort got itself lost. And it really does depend on the week that you choose to launch that. It better be a quiet week and nothing's happening, because it will just disappear. Yeah, it's the fear of change, I suppose. The UK did seem to be very far ahead for a while, and it doesn't seem that way anymore. And I think there might be a time to pull Gatwick into the phrase here now, because Ian's got it. And Gatwick really was, I think, the thing that turned the switch on innovation in the UK, and it's hurting stuff. So do you have any news for us this week, Ian?
I think in the moment, Gary, if you start off with the news this week video, and it covers actually more than Gatwick, it's kind of been a kind of airport-tastic week. So there's actually three.
Much the week of airport-related drone news.
Here we go then.
This year's Download Festival had no hysteria from East Midlands Airport. While no one, not even the CAA, who knew the outcome, bothered to say anything, an investigation by Leicestershire Police found that, in their words, on several occasions reported sightings were proven determined not to be drones. For example, instead they were transiting aircraft, etc. Meanwhile, evidence that can't yet be shown has underlined the concern that Dublin Airport has to an extent been the cause of its own drone problems. Eventually, this evidence will accidentally on purpose end up in the public domain via Twitter. Finally, and completely unexpectedly, the Home Office that oversee the police released all their Gatwick drone video and photo evidence when requested via Freedom of Information. It's amazing that so many millions of pounds was lost on such little evidence. The video doesn't conclusively prove there was a malicious drone. In fact, the shape is consistent with a DJI M210 version 1, as owned in 2018 by, you've guessed it, Sussex Police. So there's still as many questions as answers.
Yes, there's that one. Do you want to play the next one next, or?
Well, we'll have a quick chat before we do that, because it's so brief. Right. So we'll put a bit of context to it, and then we can do a bit of chat about it afterwards. So this guy Joseph Lloyd is funny. He's appeared out of nowhere from the Gatwick thing, but this guy has over 400, it might even be 500 freedom of informations in the UK. It's got them abroad as well. The freedom of information's the CIA and all kinds. So he's like fully into questioning things. So he's come on to and has asked a few questions. A lot of his stuff is still being knocked back, but completely by amazement here that the Home Office have replied, and they've adhered to the request. So they've given us what was the sum total of the Gatwick evidence in video and photo form, and it's not impressive by any means. We'll see in a minute. Well, I think at this point, actually, put it on, let people see. You'll have to play it a few times. It's only 2 seconds.
Yes.
And again, just play it and see. This is it.
There it is.
So we've gone to all that panic and all that millions of pounds lost based on evidence such as this. So this is like, wow, we've got the drone. This is the video, and now this is actually video on day 2. So at this point, Aeroscope's already up and deployed. Now, on the official timeline, the drone's apparently only seen after sunset. So it makes me think that although this was at the time making people jump up and down and going, we've got the drone, it's there, blah, 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 that I think this was checked against logs afterwards, maybe against the police drones. And they found actually it's a false positive and it's been excluded, which then could explain why the police say to this day there is no video. So yeah, it's confusing. Now the bit that's a bit bizarre about this is you can see this in the freedom of information itself. So if you have a look at it and you can check, they've attached a photograph and the video. They're both from the same device. They're both the same clip. Now it just happens. Now I don't know of any mobile phone where you can simultaneously take photos and you can simultaneously take videos. So it looks like they've actually got the photo by taking a screen grab from the video now. But this is where it gets a bit, well, I don't know, a bit odd. The photograph is at a higher resolution than the video. So what's actually happened is there must have been an original higher quality version of video, and the one that's been distributed has had the quality lowered. So it's quite a significantly lower quality bitrate and resolution. So it means either somebody doesn't quite know how a video edit has tried to just chop out those 2 seconds because they didn't want to show what happened before and after. Or you could be, or maybe they've actually tried to make it look a bit rubbish. So it's hard to argue it either way. I don't know. I'm going to just assume that it's somebody didn't know quite how to edit and it was done innocently. But it does say there we need to track down the original source video, because if you get a bit better quality, you can make a bit more out of it. But at the moment, it's just a black drone that appears to have 4 arms and landing gear, which, again, if you had landing gear, you'd have it up, not down in flight normally anyway, but I don't think you can do that with that particular DJI model. So, yeah, there's definitely a case for that being the police drone, because it fits.
To be fair, though, if it was a Canadian police drone, they're right to shut the airport down.
Well, yeah, because it probably hit something. So there we are.
Well, it does speak to you actually want to see either side of that video, because I mean I don't know, I haven't read that before, if they identify that building very well and stuff like that, because otherwise how do we even know that that's Gatwick, I suppose?
Yeah, they don't identify it at all. There's no EXIF data. This is why I think it's probably a screen grab, though. Normally in a photograph you have EXIF data, which is the GPS location and so on. There's none of that there. So yeah, but basically, when we thought we'd see some video, we thought we'd have, something one way or the other. But really, this doesn't prove anything, and still leaves as much questions as it does answers. So I think it's still
banging on about them being so fast. There's nowhere, so small and so fast. There's no way you can film them, and etc. And there's but as we know, if you've watched any of those CSI programs, there will be someone to say, zoom in, make it a bit clearer, and we'll be able to read the registration on the side of the thing and everything.
But only the police have that technology. It's not available to anyone else. Only law enforcement and movie studios.
Yeah. They'll be able to do that.
I was thinking for comedy value to present that video when I compared it with the imageries of actually doing. I'm trying to think what the phrase is when they do with that, but they do something like, let's clarify that. And it goes and zooms in. So
it shows the serial number. Show the serial number.
Yeah. I was going to do that for comedy value, but there just wasn't time. So, but I just thought, let's see what we could match in with that and what would be a viable drone. So
without wanting to get Richard into trouble, though, but actually this is a kind of a good segue to talking back to retention of data. If that was a good police authority and they used Altitude Angel as their UTM, then there would at least be those logs kicking about of that flight somewhere, or that was going to happen. But of course, there should be a paper. There should be a traditional paper log for that flight if it was the police, and the police should be releasing or not releasing that if it wasn't there.
And didn't they have aeroscopes running? Surely they logged all the flights of DJI drones.
Yeah, it had aeroscope running. The trouble is here, the police will say, this is policing information. If we were to release this, it will hinder our ability to police in future. That's what they always do, which is basically meaning we don't want you to see the whole facts. So you'll be in the dark. And Richard, if Altitude Angel had that, we couldn't request it anyway. They're a private company, and they wouldn't be providing that information if it was to be asked anyway. That comes back to the privacy Richard talked about that would apply to everybody equally.
Yeah, and just we for instance, we can't even go fishing for it on our own systems because every single record access that one of our team does, including me for instance, is audited. So you can't even go looking without there being an audit trail. And I think that's we've had that in our system since kind of 2016, I think, something like that, which is way in advance of when you'd find a lot of huge companies, and many of whom don't even know who's looked at their records, right? So I think it's really important that if those records are kept, that the access to them is also audited, because they, in my view, they should also be subject to public scrutiny as well. And if it's an agency collecting those records, I think there are very few exceptions through which they're legally allowed to say, no, I'm not giving you these records, but we all trust in the law to get that right, don't we? But in those reasons, in this instance, obviously, I've only just seen this FOI request, by the way, and it looks like it was granted, on the 8th of June or something. It doesn't look like they've turned over a whole bunch of information, right? I mean, I don't know how you make a decision off of that 2-second clip to close an airport or do things like that, but there must have been more to the situation, to the moment. But then again, these requests can sometimes, I guess, you can kind of fall victim to your own request because you only get what you precisely ask for. So if you haven't then asked for what was the sequence of events leading up to this, who was in the vicinity, what were the police up to, you're just going to get this one thing. And so I think if there are other requests to be made, maybe that would help to make sense of it more.
Yeah, I mean, with this was so specific, saying give us all your video, because the point that came out from this is the police said, as Gary was going about, to Parliament, that there was no video because it flew too fast to film with a mobile phone. And we're seeing, so obviously then Freedom of Information came out that said actually there was video recorded by London Gatwick Airport that was passed on to the Ministry of Department of Transport. We passed it on to the Ministry of Defence, and that's how this Freedom of Information came about, because the Department for Transport said we can't find this video anymore. It's gone. We don't know where it's gone, but it's vanished. So then your only other options to ask some of the partner agencies, and obviously here, the Home Office, to all our surprises, has said this is what all our entirety, the video and photos that we've got about Gatwick. So, but yes, that's I think part of the problem with Gatwick. It wasn't done by evidence and video that was concrete. It was done by people seeing things. And if you look at Freedom of Information's with emails that are going backwards and forward, even number 10 was directly criticising the information they were getting, or complete lack of it, from Sussex Police. So even day or two in, they were getting nothing back. So really, no one knew what was going on other than what was in the newspapers. So what was feeding a lot of the reactions and decisions was actually people going, well, look, there's a picture of it in the Sun, not knowing that picture in the Sun was actually a helicopter and so on. So I think, unfortunately, we had this thing where the press were guessing what was going on. That was then feeding into the decisions, and we just ended up with this.
I think, I mean, you end up in almost hysteria, don't you? When people don't actually know what's going on, you can have lots and lots of quote unquote information being thrown at you. And I've often wondered, if I was the person in charge of security at Gatwick, what the hell would I have done at that point? And I don't know. I mean, no one knows what was in the mindset of that person, I guess. There's no FOI that will give me the transcript of your internal monologue. But if you're the first ever drone suspected incident, at a major airport, you don't want to go down in history as the guy that refused to close the airport for the EasyJet flight coming in, right? Or leaving. Equally, I mean, you don't want to be the guy that closes the airport for no reason either. So I'd like to think that there are much better systems in place and much better procedures, and I think certainly there are almost certainly better procedures. I worry a little bit about the system side because we work increasingly with different so-called counter UAS companies and drone detection system providers, and there's a problem there because you don't necessarily have better information, you just have lots of conflicting information at your fingertips now. And what's of course changed since 2018 is there are more drones, there are more people flying them. So guess what? If you're a drone detection system, you're going to detect a lot of stuff. And how do you subtract, the authorized users that maybe Gatwick have given permission to people to bimble around in the FRZ to, or you're the police? How do you subtract that from the actual picture that you're sensing? And how do you make sense, basically? And I fear that in that hysteria that ensued, where there was government money spewed out for airports to protect against this thing, because obviously it became quite political, right? That people suddenly forgot about the need to actually make sense of what they're doing. Because now everyone can say, it doesn't matter, I bought system X and system Y and system Z, and therefore I've done everything I possibly can. A bit like, back in the day, no one got fired for choosing IBM, right? To do write some software for a big council. It was very expensive and took years, but it was IBM, right? What could go wrong? I wonder about that now with these big defence primes selling counter UAS.
Now, Richard, I have to wonder, have you actually been to management school? Because you know what happens if you're faced with a decision where it could be a no-win. Good management delegates.
Yeah, you just point at, I don't know, the cleaner or something.
Yeah.
You have the con, and then you just walk out.
Absolutely. Well, the fitting of these systems is all very well and good. And I think maybe it's not totally something to think of today. But I mean, Bruce is very much an antenna man. And if your runway was a little bit raised at one end, maybe you wouldn't want to stick the poles up on a little bit of a platform so that if anyone ran off the runway, they'd go into the pole, at least give them a run up to it going down the slope. So perhaps you might put your antennas at effectively ground level to the runway for your drone detection system. Do you think that's going to work if you did that sort of thing? If you install it like that, Bruce?
Of course, absolutely. Subterranean is the preferred option, but that's the trouble when you have people who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think you follow Twitter for Ian's view on that.
I was just going to jump in and say I understand the concerns about a lot of this stuff, and I think there's probably just there is in the UTM world, right? There's a lot of snake oil out there. There are a few fairly good, people out there in this industry that are really trying to, deploy reasonably good systems in a challenging environment. But if, it doesn't matter what you're sensing. If you're looking for an RF broadcast signal from a drone, or you're just trying to simply sense the analog world, any one of us that's ever worked with a microprocessor and an analog sensor will know just how difficult that is. And then these guys are in some instances trying to put detection systems like RF detection systems in a busy place where there is a lot of RF anyway. And everyone walks around with a transmitter. Everyone walks around with all these different receivers. I imagine it's just an absolute nightmare. And all I can say is, I'm not an RF guy, but we are procuring a lot of different sensors, and we've had an opportunity to test an awful lot of them. And there are some really good ones. They stand out because they work, or at least they work in known criteria, in known conditions. And there is just some absolute trash on the market. And my worry is people buy it and they think they've got security, right? And that should be an offence, I think, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, what was that? There was something in the US, wasn't there, years ago, about a guy who sold like bomb detection systems or something, and it was just literally like an empty black box or something. People were, it's horrible. We're laughing about it, but people were dying because they bought this guy's nonsense, basically. And I think he did go to jail. But I think it's a similar thing here. If you're preying on people's fears, or you at least, maybe both people need to go to jail for that. The guy that's trying to sell it and the guy that went, yeah, I'll buy that, and never tested it. It's just so difficult, isn't it?
It's funny you mention that, because I'm sure that Kevin on Twitter, Kevin Finisterre, he opened up one of the early counter drone systems, really expensive thing. It was in an IP66 box, and it was just a Raspberry Pi inside. With some antennas, so it was something really, really basic. So yes, there probably is some of that goes on.
I'm looking for my guarded switch.
Yeah, I was gonna say you've probably not seen it, Richard, but there's been months of Gatwick-esque comedy that's been going on at Dublin Airport, and there it seems to be that they've got a counter drone system, but they're using manual processes instead. And it just seems to be an entire muddle. And instead of trying to nail down detecting things, a narrative's been there that's completely different to what we know goes on in the UK. And they're saying, at Gatwick, that they don't try and detect them. They don't try and turn up and say, oh, what you're doing with that drone, and, with the police and so on. They're saying, no, they bring out the guns. They bring out the jamming guns and they jam them all. So despite saying they've got a detection system, which is questionable to how good a system they've set up. In that, not necessarily not the particular system, but when you buy a system, you can go and buy it cheap. You can just buy a few sensors, blah blah blah, or you can go and you can max out and buy, you can max up to a really expensive system. And obviously, in an airport, you don't want to be doing something like you might be protecting, a unit on an industrial estate. You want to, it's got to be so much more. But yeah, they've instead of really admitting that detection should really be a key, they've very much gone down. We'll have the handheld gun, we'll zap it all wonderful afterwards.
I think that the challenge as well is, right, the sensor's only as good as the thing that it, well, assuming it's a good sensor and it's actually going to do what it's sold as doing, it's only going to detect the things that it's designed to detect, right? So, you know, if you're an RF detection system, for instance, if no one is broadcasting, you are invisible. So you know, like any person in the security world will tell you, security is a series of layers, right? You have different things for different jobs. They have multiple systems that put them together. But then the moment you add another sensor into the mix, you need to have an overarching system of intelligence, right? Something that brings it together. And there are even companies that, you know, some of them have approached us, by the way, when we did, you know, lots of the Skyway announcements, etc., where they try and sell you software to take data from counter-drone systems that they've never even heard of. So there's been no testing. And therefore, you then just get this great fused output, and you can have all your authorized drones from your non-authorized drones. And we're like, well, how do you do this? Like, where are you getting all the authorized data from? So it's all very interesting.
So these things cost millions and millions of dollars. I wonder how many man hours of someone standing there with a pair of binoculars, highly adaptive mindset, able to see stuff. Why not just employ someone with binoculars to keep an eye on shift? So 24-hour surveillance with the binoculars, and they can make their own decisions. It's intelligent, don't need artificial intelligence, it has good range, and they can make decisions that a system like that couldn't otherwise do.
You can't do binoculars. You just can't see the whole airspace. But I think SUAS News needs to have some sort of prize thing where you send people out, because Mitchell Roberts there definitely
you got straight there. He hit a nail on the head immediately, didn't he? Made me smile as well.
That's not easy to see straight away. And if you don't know you counter drone, you won't know that. But that is bang on. That is D-drone, and that's a certain airport we've mentioned today. But yes.
Ian and I did a little exercise in working out the RF, and I assumed that you would put it on the tower. Silly old me. We know what assume does. At least you'd put your antennas at height, but you can see that's down. One of those is very down the side of the runway, and with our plot from the top of the tower at that particular airfield, there were great channels of darkness for RF. That you could fly down, like in Star Wars, down the tunnel, and that's just so where they've placed those there. It's all part of the mix. It's no good buying stuff and then putting it down the bottom of a coal mine. I don't know. Bruce, yes, do you have an opinion on that?
But yeah, I do. Perhaps they put it there so that it's not going to pick up all the ISM broadcasts from the town and around. So it's shielded by its geographical location, and the drone will be flying high, so it doesn't matter if it's close to the ground because you'll get that elevated signal.
Okay. Yeah,
that could be.
All right then. Yeah. All right then. Yeah.
One thing that it could be, I mean, I'm not privy to this kind of information, but again, working a lot with these RF detection systems, antenna placement is everything, not necessarily from a reception perspective, but because you want multiple receivers to pick up the signal, right? So the further apart, that's why it might be in a really odd location. I mean, I don't know where this is, I don't know where the photo was taken, but what I have known is, I think the general public, right, if they see something like that on a pole, they think it's going to see everything around it. It might not be designed to do that. It might just be designed to corroborate something else, another sensor somewhere else is seeing as part of the network. But I don't know a lot about the D-drone system. We don't use that system on our Skyway network at the moment, but certainly placement is key.
Yeah, and also two antennas like that, it could be a phased array, because then you get directionality from an otherwise omnidirectional receiver setup.
Yeah, I mean, what you had there was one was an RF sensor, and the next to it was a PTZ. Now, with the RF sensors, as you say, there's a number of companies that do those. And really, you need to have enough of those that you can triangulate the drone's position. But this is where spending comes into it, because you can buy the system with just one sensor, and it will simply say there is a drone. There is a drone present, but it won't tell you where it is. Or you could buy it with a number of sensors, and then obviously it would triangulate and give you that information. So really, the results you get out of it, are proportionate to the amount of money you spend putting the sensors. And as you say,
not with D-drone, it's not.
in the right place. It might be worth a later date, Gary, if you do the if you actually show the sort of geography of it, the airport, you can see, as Gary was saying, there are valleys alongside the airport that you could just fly a drone down and you will be below. You know, basically the ground will be between you and those RF sensors. So that kind of suggests that those would be blind spots. I know Gary didn't want to pull that up initially because we didn't want to give anybody any ideas. But when you are talking about it, yeah, but for people that haven't visualized it, it kind of helps you think, wait a minute, you know, is this where the issues come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think we briefly did it, but I mean, there's great gaps in, and it's I'm getting there. I'm letting it resolve. I've forgotten where they are. This seems so long ago now. It's not that one. There it is.
Shall we waffle on while you look for it?
So yeah. It's probably for the best.
Go on, Bruce. You jump in for now. I think Bruce has gone to sleep.
Yeah, it's gone to sleep. Here we are. It is Dublin. Now, up over here, where was a golf course? There it was here. There's a valley here. So if that sensor is down on here, and I'm going to make another assumption that it is down somewhere down here, because
I forgot to send you. I do know the location.
Oh, okay. Well,
I actually think it is north. I think it is.
Oh, it's north. Oh, then it's looking down that valley that we identified. That was that valley there, wasn't it? If we had our sensor up on the tower. But that's the thing, you'd have to, and there's actually some hills down over here where I think I would put my gear. But look, as Bruce mentioned, the ISM signals. Look at the whole city to the south of it. Look at all those places where people will be flying in their garden. Yeah, it's a nonsense thing. It was what's he say? Acme drone detection system. There we go. He's got the
the trouble with that, Bruce, is its eyes looking at the sky and seeing lights. It's got us on all this bother to begin with.
Yeah, but obviously it works. It can detect drones that aren't even there. It's that effective.
But surely, and then so if you use those new Apple goggles, then do like the eyes go bigger or something when it sees a drone, or some sort of thing flashes up on that screen in front? I've heard that screen in the front, I don't know if I said this last week, is so that people can see the tears in your eyes for how much money you've spent on the thing. I believe that's what those forward.
I want the FPV version where we plug in the little receiver, then fly FPV like that, and then you can convince the regulator, I'm observing myself. See, there's my eyes.
Yes,
I love the arguments over the Apple thing. There's people saying, "Oh yeah, but you'd have to spend $2,500 on a PC for VR," and I'm thinking nonsense. I mean, I've had full VR. I didn't spend anywhere near that on a PC that was capable of doing it all. So you can shop around and do it cheap. And the thing you realise with VR is it's all down to the software, and you realise a lot of the software's rubbish and wouldn't keep you entertained. So it doesn't matter how good your hardware is. If the software isn't there that makes it that you want to use it, then it's just going to end up collecting dust. So,
and who remembers 3D TV?
You're not going to buy the Apple Vision Pro then, Ian, is what I'm hearing.
Well, no, I mean, I had VR, and much as I tried to like it, it's those problems. You've got a room that's, such a size that, in the UK, we don't have big, huge properties where we could be running about, and I can be like, yes, I'm VRing in a big, massive cave here and battling all these things. By the time I've taken a step forward to hit something, I'm punching the wall and then having to fix the plasterboard later. So it's just those.
Oh, come on, you're not that strong.
Yeah, I am. It only really suits sit down games, and then that as well is because the vision, the motion sickness. Even if you're not, even if you got a really fast update rate and you're a bit tuned to it, it's still not that pleasant experience when you're moving about. If you're moving about and it's like you're putting a car or you're putting a vehicle, it feels natural to you because you sat down, and that's fine and that's great. So you kind of have to tune your experiences round VR. So there's still a lot of experiences you wouldn't want to do, but you think, actually, great though it was, I'd rather sit on the couch with my Xbox pad playing a game. Pizza comes along. The VR just isn't that practical when it comes down to it. Right. It's like the Wii. You thought, brilliant, you do it, and you do it for a while, and then it's history.
Yeah, it's a novelty factor. Look at the 3D TVs that people bought. They use them now for 3D? No, they don't. There's the wow factor the first 30 minutes, and then it's 2 years of buyer's remorse. And the thing is that
with 3D, though, I will jump in there. Sorry to talk to you for a second, but with the 3D, I'd have loved to see more 3D in that. What destroyed that was suddenly people thought there's money in it and just made lots of. They took 2D movies and tried to make them 3D, so everyone was trying to cash in it. So again, it was crap content that destroyed that. But I get what you're saying.
Yeah, notice Apple are pushing also the augmented reality rather than virtual reality, augmented reality. But there's so many downsides. I mean, you sit down to watch a movie and you have this wonderful big, virtual screen and all this virtual surroundings. You can be on a beach in your living room watching a big screen TV suspended in the air. But when you're watching a movie, you don't take any notice of your surroundings. It's like you tune out on that. And if the family wants to watch it and you got 5 in the family, well, you're looking at what, 15, 16, 17 grand worth of headgear. You can buy an awfully good state-of-the-art huge OLED TV for $3.5 grand.
Or projector.
Yeah. Well, but it does lead into the all of that. I think Richard's world might end up being a little bit in that. I can easily see that being a useful way of displaying lots of aeronautical information in front of a controller or an assistant that's on the lookout. Those virtual binoculars, if you will. Modern digital binoculars looking around the sky for threats. All in context.
I mean, if you're talking about something that's going to go in an airport environment or an air traffic control environment, then you're going to first meet, like in the old days, if you wanted to put a system in the cloud, you'd meet the security guy in a company, right? And the security guy would be like, no, that's a terrible idea. The cloud is a bad place. Well, airports have one called the HMI guy. And the HMI's guy's job is to think about the human-machine interaction elements and the impacts of that on safety. So the idea that you might obscure an air traffic controller's eyeballs with anything is probably going to take a little bit of a challenge. However, one of the things I have seen, which I think has got legs, for lack of a better phrase, is where you have airports which are already using virtual towers, which is where they basically have a copy of a control room somewhere else, a tower, with these enormous big, sort of probably Panasonic, suitably aviation grade, awesome portrait style screens all around. And for all intents and purposes, like a really old fashioned Disney simulation, right? You walk into it and you believe that you're in a tower because you're used to seeing these wall to ceiling windows. And what I've seen that works really, really well is where you annotate digitally on those screens the things you're looking at. And there are companies out there, like we're working quite closely with Saab at the moment, it's all public domain stuff, to bring that kind of intelligence, right? Because again, if we're about encouraging drone flights, legitimate drone flights, obviously, commercial drone flights in and around airport environments, in the FRZs, where all the businesses are, right? Where people want to go fly. You want to encourage people to do that, and you want the airport to want to welcome them. And they don't want to see all the drones that they've authorized, right? They just don't care about them. They just want to see the one that's there, or maybe there, the one that they think is there that shouldn't be, right? And that's where those systems can really, really come into their own, because you can literally just put a big, if you wanted something garish, like a big red target reticle around it and say, no one knows what that is, right? And that's, I think, the next iteration. But to get there, you've either got to be ultra modern and spankingly brand new as an airport, or that technology just looks like something that you'd never have, and it's not cheap, right? But yeah, getting to this kind of data-driven, software-driven environment is very difficult, I think, for virtually every airport, every air traffic control authority around the world, because they're just not thinking about it. And who's going to be blaming them, right? Because you've got these big defense primes that make billions out of nation states over decades. They're not incentivized to change. Every time you want to change that 6 character code there from a 6 character code to a 7 character code, that's a change request. We've got to go through HMI, we've got to go through testing. There's probably a couple of $100,000 in that. It's the paperwork is mandrolic, and that is all for safety reasons. Some of it I think makes a lot of good sense, but I think where it prohibits is new technology doing things cheaply, but for a greater safety outcome. And I think regulators don't have tools to assess those incredible benefits for technology.
They do now. It's called AI.
Yes,
I don't know what to say about that. You almost triggered me, so I'm just going to step back.
It must be time to add AI. You can't have any pitch deck now without the word AI in it. Surely that's illegal. If you don't have AI in it, then you don't count.
It's AI, big data, blockchain. That's my other trigger word. And if you actually have an AI, big data, blockchain, ADSB receiving system, then actually you've got something that's worth investing in.
So now these new air taxis are AAIM.
Yes,
that's true.
Yes. Yeah, no, I did. Last week I said I did have a press release with that hit all the ding, 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 ding. And it should be, like Ian said, there's a prize earlier. There should be like lights should flash and everything should go. And you've achieved buzzword Nirvana. Well done.
One thing, this is probably completely random, but it's only us four here, right? No one else is listening. So I figure one thing that might be worth just kind of circling back on is this concept of HMI, right? Because you were talking about virtual reality and 3D, and that's because you're thinking about this cool stuff because you've experienced a lot of different technology. But for a lot of people in aviation, the gold standard is being able to represent something like an aeronautical chart in 3D on something like Google Earth, right? So just being able to say, you know that CTR that you're used to looking at, it's not actually flat. And then they can show you a copy of like Google Earth with a 3D volume of space on it. That's one tenders for people, right? And it frustrates the life out of me because then I'm like, now I want the HMI guy to walk into the room and like, have you tried using that in reality? Because humans are just terrible at staring at a 3D thing on a 2D screen and making potentially security related decisions. It just doesn't work. There's a reason that an aeronautical chart's still a 2D, right? Because it's the simplest form of understanding where you are. You don't have to worry about the elevation component. But yeah, no, there are loads of companies out there right now that are literally making a quick buck with airports, with ANSPs in many respects, because they've got a 3D map, and it's just something we've intensely resisted. And actually, we were doing these beta tests for Drone Assist, and it was about a third of users come to us and said, "Hey," because we asked everyone like, what kind of features would you love to see? You know, it's a completely open question. And some people are like, oh, we'd love to 3D maps. And you sit them down, you bring these people in, you say, right, here's a 3D map. Now accomplish all of these tasks you've just done in 2D. And invariably, it took those people 2 to 3 times longer to do the same exact task, because now they've got to figure out how to move around in 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional screen. And it's just, that's when, as I say, that's when you want the HMI guy to come back in the room and just, that's gimmick. In fact, I would pay as a taxpayer to have someone like that in every public procurement whose sole job it is. They have like a predefined list of buzzwords, and then they just disqualify bidders if they appear with them straight away. Blockchain would be on it. I'd disqualify anyone that said ADSB just because I hate ADSB. But there's probably a few other bits there. In fact, I don't hate ADSB. I just hate anyone that thinks ADSB is the answer. And what was the question?
It's like remote ID. What was the question? And the thing is, I forgot what I was going to say. I'm old. It's terrible.
I'm old and I'm cold as well.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was the shiny things thing of the world, isn't it? And I mean, the big inhibitor, the big buzzword is going to be this moving forward, as America does seem to be marching towards. They've given a load of money for US companies to police departments and stuff to go out and buy American, and they really seem like they might push the button on banning DJI, and it's going to be green. That's why I was taking that green thing. That's why I thought on Sunday I've got to just put something down just to delineate it for this day. But it's $100,000 per thing that you make to get it signed off into the green UAS scheme. That is going to destroy small innovation in America. It's game over. It's not going to happen. It's not going to promote it at all. You got three or four autopilots, $500,000. Watch them. Just watch your little company spend that. So
we've just been saying how they're moving forward and innovative with regulation, and then they're taking 7 steps backwards with implementation.
But that's not the FAA. That's the AUVSI standing up and saying, "Oh, well, we obviously know our stuff. We're we have trade shows, therefore we should set standards. What rubbish.
A lot of this stuff is open day, though, right? To a lot of people. Like, again, even the standards, very recently, it's only recently the European Commission released what's called its acceptable means of compliance documents, right? So you had a whole bunch of regulation that no one knew what would be acceptable to the regulator from a position of compliance. And then in the meantime, you had all these companies springing up to try and sell you sort of paperwork effectively that would help you prove compliance against something the regulator hadn't even decided how you would do. So I think, again, everyone thinks they can get a first mover advantage, and remote ID, I think, was key to that. And obviously you saw big companies that may or may not rhyme with Google go into that kind of ilk and try and push things in a particular direction, because everyone thinks that they need to own that, right? Everyone wants to own that. But the reality is that these technologies are springing up around an industry which is actually the bigger industry, right? The transformation of aviation, the change of how people access and utilize the sky, that's the big industry. That's the thing that we all care about. But getting in the way of a lot of that progress is all of this FOD, all these companies trying to make a quick buck. Regulators who are trying to do their best but probably just can't deal with all the noise. They're not probably didn't get out, probably never got their job because they were drone experts, right? There was some compliance guy or something else, certifying Boeing aircraft parts, and then he got pushed into the drone team. It's just confusing, and I think it's really difficult when you get big governing bodies or big trade associations then also weighing in. And we fell foul of this at AA years ago, right? You have Global UTM Association, and the charter for that was brilliant. I was a board member there for a while. In the end, I resigned because we just kind of turned around and said, well, hang on a second, you're not representing the members now, you're representing the members that have the most money. And that, at the time, obviously that wasn't us. There was a very large American company in there getting its way. But that's how these things happen. And it's, maybe I'm a little cynical, but money is what tends to drive the regulatory side of things, either because you can influence and you can meet more people, or because you can just get there first and you can shout loudest. It's not necessarily the best ideas that the ones that make it. And that, I think, is what the internet should be helping with, right? It should be helping to share the good information that's out there. I get off my high horse now.
That's a reasonable horse. The thing is, people don't seem to want to, educate themselves about what potentially might happen. So, again, we'll use that DJI example. Now, companies in America, pardon? Something might happen to why? Why something might something? They've not kept up remote ID. What? Pardon? September? Hey, hang on a minute. When's that come from? Where's that just arrived from? It's like, no, we've been banging on about all this for years. I guess people just get into using their drones, and so they should, for whatever commercial purpose they need it, and they don't care about what else is going on. And then you stick their head above the parapet every once in a while and go, oh, crikey, look what's coming down the road. It just seems, I suppose in manned aviation, there's a broader, people take a broader interest. Perhaps it's just a nerdy interest, a broader interest in what goes on in aviation and keep up with it. So I don't think we necessarily keep up with what regulators are proposing quite so well in this industry yet. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And I think one of the other things that confuses a lot of people is the process by which regulators go through to consult. Quite often, you sort of get involved in a process when a decision has sort of been made, and you kind of get the very strong impression, actually, that you and a whole bunch of other companies are now there, legitimately to have a debate, but it doesn't really matter what you say because your presence validates the assumptions that have been pre-made before you walk in. And you kind of want to be in the room with the people forming the opinions, right? Because actually that is the worst part about public procurement, is those opinions that people hold are the ones that then inform how the procurement takes shape. So if you ask dumb questions, or you ask questions which are unduly influenced by one vendor, then you end up with a system which is obviously skewed towards the one person you've been listening most towards. And again, that's something which we've just become so exposed to over the years. And it's not just the UK, by the way. This is all over the place. Maybe with the exception of one or two countries who have done an absolute stellar job of just being transparent. And just to be really clear, because I'm sure someone will try and trawl the internet and find out where we work. One of those is in a country that we won a bid in, and one of those is where we didn't, but we still went, okay, massive respect, you published all the results, and it was very obvious to see how this process worked. But there have been some absolute atrocious examples as well, many of them actually in the EU, so make of that what you will.
Yeah, right. Well, that's use space we're talking about there, isn't it? I think some nations might try and hold. Yeah, that's not as transparent. That's not as lovely as EASA would have make out. Really, that whole use space thing.
There's another thing that is a trouble with a lot of the EU stuff as well, because all you have to do, you know, they've been sort of pimping the electric vertical takeoff vehicles, and then there's a certain Chinese one, and they're flying them about, and you go, RG Pilot, you know, seeing that screenshot there with RG Pilot on there, what do you think about that? And they're just like, they don't even want to reply, but you know, stuff like that. It's stuff where people should be replying and understanding what they're pushing. And there's, I was just going to say with Richard, the T word transparency is just key to everything. Everything that irks all of us, no matter you know what your interest is within the drone domain. The one thing that irks people is where there isn't transparency. If things are just clear and honest and open, and this is how this came about, people just generally, fine, I understand now, and they can move on.
Yeah, transparency would make a lot of things better, but again, you've got to trust people to understand what they're being told, and actually a lot of people don't take the time. But I guess the other thing as well is, speaking of time, right, have you noticed the older you get, the quicker time appears to have gone in hindsight, right? When you look back, you're like, oh my goodness, my daughter's 2 years old now, or something like that, and where did that go in a blink of an eye? The reason I bring that up is because I think aviation regulation and people that work in that domain operate in a similar ilk, right? They forget that what they've actually done is set an impossibly high barrier to entry for a new classification of air traffic, which is not at the scale or doing the things that current aviation is doing, right? And actually, those regulations were introduced very gradually over decades. And now what you've got is an insurmountable, sometimes actually invisible, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute if anyone wants to hear about that, but you get these decades of regulation which are then applied to something this big, flying in a field at 200 feet. And you know, you've actually got someone with a very legitimate business interest, or just a societal interest. You know, there's a company that's desperate to get airborne, flying defibrillators around because they can get there much quicker than an ambulance stuck in rush hour traffic. I think that's a great idea. Other people think maybe that's a terrible idea, but until you're the guy dying of a heart attack and possibly brain death because your ambulance is stuck in, I don't know, it could be stuck at A&E, or it could just be stuck in rush hour traffic, you'd wish that the guy with a £1,000 drone and the £1,000 defibrillator attached to it had got to you. I don't understand why we can't make that kind of technology accessible, even in a more readily accessible trial format, right? Because none of this stuff happened when the Wright brothers got airborne. There were no regulations, there was no air traffic control. But those two idiots, you know, they got in an aircraft, right, and flew it. And the risk to them, the risk to people on the ground was infinite. So I think we spend a lot of time trying to remind well-intentioned people that aviation was never about the elimination of risk. There is acceptable risk in commercial aviation today. There are numerous air prox incidents that occur on a daily basis, numerous illegal transgressions into controlled airspace that don't go followed up. We're fine with all of that, but don't you come 1 metre inside my FRZ, governor, because that's a risk. That's outrageous. What about the Cessna? He's a nautical mile inside your controlled airspace. These things, I think, should just be discussed, because I think they're just taken for granted. And that is killing innovation. And with that kills investment, and that kills everyone's ideas, right? And we sit at the cusp, right? We just help people get airborne. We don't fly for business purposes, right? We don't go out, we don't do drone surveying, we don't do drone deliveries. We help other people occupy the sky. So you hear all of these frustrated people that just want to fly. And quite often that invisible point is just about, not knowing quite often what barrier what bar you need to hit, because actually regulators won't tell you. either because they don't know or because they've got some mistaken belief that they can't, quote unquote, mark their own homework. It's like, well, respectfully, if you have a new technology, you want to bring it to market, you're proposing to spend a couple of million quid trying to get that certified, you're asking what that process is, you're employing people to do it, you're willing to pay the regulator to put the time to it, but then they want you to test it in a vacuum and then just chuck it over the wall at the people that will do the testing and not know what their reasonable expectations might have been about this new technology they're being asked to certify is just insane. And that's the UK, that's other territories, that's the US. One place it's not is Singapore, right? It's slightly more modern and thinking about things in Singapore, but that has got to change. So transparency, I agree with you, and that was a long rant to go back to transparency and say, fine, apply it in your thinking. And I think there was a little caption that popped up about competency culture. I like that one. I think that's a really good idea. I mean, no one is suggesting that we don't want to be safe, right? No one I've ever spoken to in the drone industry, bar one or two absolute idiots, think that the sky should just be a complete free-for-all, do whatever you like. But every commercial drone pilot I've met, for instance, cares quite deeply about what they're doing, right? They've spent money on this thing, they don't want to harm anyone, they're just normal people. Just like I'm entrusted when I get in a car, everyone has to assume I'm not going to just go run around and drive into buildings and cause damage. It's the same thing with a drone, right? Everyone is trying to do the right thing, but fear is what stops most people from making sensible decisions. So yeah, I'd love to see competency. I don't know if the commenter there meant competency in terms of regulations that are described in terms of competency levels, or just competent people assessing those regulations. I don't know quite what you meant, but I like the concept generally.
I think, Richard, you made a good point, and it's one that Bruce makes often as well. I think I've seen him make it on Twitter, and I'm sure you've said it on here, and it's really, really frustrating, and it's really what's hindering the UK, and it's getting worse. Is this we're operating from this premise of, if there's a drone in the sky, it's going to do something nasty. It's going to do something wrong. The assumption is, if there's a drone there and I don't know about it, it's up to no good. And that's nonsense. The drones that are up there are doing either commercial work or a hobbyist. Even if he's there, he's taking photos of a sunset. He's taking photos of something interesting. He's not going out, I'm going to fly my drone into somebody's face. He spent his money on that drone. He wants to get some cool shots. He wants to put it on social media. And we've just got into this silly situation that we don't have with vehicles. Yet it's vehicles, as unfortunately we've seen in the last 24 hours, where again, it's vehicles and it's knives. They're being used to go out and kill people. And we're not having this ridiculous discussion with them that we're having with drones, and we're seeing it continuously. There's another one that's come out in the last few days of more airspace restrictions. Every single concert, if you're in the West Midlands, is it saying we're putting a big no-fly zone around it, a mile and a half, whatever. We're going to assume if you're putting a drone there, you're up to no good, and it's absolute insanity. We need to sort of get a grip and saying, why is this going on? This didn't happen a number of years ago. And, if you go back to, say, 2015, the drones that were being flown then were nowhere near as safe as today. I was flying around the big Vulcan Mantis, which is very good airframes. I'm not saying that was, but, DJI NASA on there. It's, that was a stupid controller. To be fair, the software wasn't great. Some of it went out with bugs. A2, that's some problems. The Wukong, although people swore by it, wasn't actually that good. What RG did was just leagues ahead of all that. But we were flying all that about and nobody cared less. And now people are flying around these little tiny drones, can virtually do no harm. And we've got so many software safeguards, and we've just got this ludicrous sort of opinion. And it's the people that are within, like your regulators. And so it's not all the police by any means, but you've certainly got, this sort of mindset going on of, we've got to ground them, we can't handle this. And it's like, where's all this come from?
As Richard alluded to, there seems to be different standards set. We've got we don't know how safe drones have to be. There's never been one death associated with the recreational use of multi-rotor drones, but we continue to regulate, restrict, and control. Meanwhile, how many people die every week in manned aviation incidents, preventable manned aviation incidents? We don't see any changes in the regulations there. It seems that we have become a spotlight thrown on this hobby and this industry for probably reasons of either ignorance or money. That's the only things I can think of.
I need to think Flight's email address. He needs to be on here. One of the best channels on YouTube. Obviously not as good as Bruce, plainly, but it's really fantastic stuff. And I hope, has everyone seen that giant rubber band powered airplane yet? You're just all supposed to nod and say yes now. Focus on safety. Choose the safety. Yeah, I completely get that. And I just wanted to jump back to the airspace incursions that Richard mentioned. I want a summer job instead of working down the supermarket. I want my summer job to go off in one of Richard's mobile vans, or 2 or 3 of them actually, and go around the UK and park them in places where I know I'm going to see loads of airspace incursions. And then at the end of the summer, just go, dear CAA, what have you done about this lot? Yeah.
The interesting thing is there's no easy route for a civilian to provide that data to a regulator, or for a private company to provide that data, because there's never been a need for it. So, that's an interesting thing, right? Our sensor network does pick up an enormous amount of activity, and trying to understand what should be our role in that. Should we use that data to point out the obvious hypocrisy or the obvious fallacies in a lot of the assumptions that regulators are making? Does that help? Does that hinder? We're not trying to be combative, but I think one of the things that's really missing quite often, and again, I want to be really clear, it's not just about the UK, abroad, same things occur. There is just a big vacuum of data, right? And there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of misinformation. There are some reasonable questions that people ask, like you were just asking, about vehicles, for instance. Millions of road accidents globally every year, but we allow them. Visual line of sight is the thing that really frustrates me, because obviously that's the tenet of aviation. That's the basis, the fundamental backstop in all aviation is visual line of sight. Yet trying to get a quantified answer about what that looks like in terms of what's the actual standard that's got to be beat is really, really challenging. And actually, if that is the gold standard to beat, then why do planes still sometimes actually land on planes? Why do pilots crash into other pilots? If that is the gold standard, that is the best we can do, then what we are actually acknowledging is that gold standard does result in more deaths still than drones do. And that's an interesting dichotomy. I'm not saying there's a sort of universal truth to be derived on that, but I think if we're going to throw around concerns, we should also throw around the facts, right? And then we can decide what to do about it. But things get very biased. And I think a lot of people, it doesn't help, but a lot of people think that there's some kind of nefariousness associated with that. But I read somewhere, and someone in the comments I'm sure will correct me, but someone once said, or I read, that you should never attribute to malice what can be easily explained by incompetence. And when I feel my blood pressure rising, right, I kind of just try and go back to that. And I'm just like, does this person really work for some global government cabal, or are they just confused? And how can we try and move this conversation along? Because I just think there's so much confusion out there.
Yeah, red card rewarded. Well done, Bruce. He needed that. He did need the red card of sensibility.
There is no place.
Oh, that's what it was for. I was like, what have I got the red card for this time?
Well, yeah, as you know, we don't allow common sense and sensible stuff here.
Facts do not support the narrative. There's no room for them.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Cool Cat saying the hundreds of iFlight drones in Russia. Yeah, that is quite a thing. Do we believe that photo, though? Do we actually believe that photo?
I think with the stuff that's going on in Russia and Ukraine, we've got to be careful, especially as I saw. We didn't show the video, I don't think, on here, but there was a really interesting one, and there was a video went out and it had millions of views and been reshared, and people assumed it was genuine. It was where Ukraine was saying, we've flown a drone over to Russia, and it was a multicopter. You're thinking, well, you've not actually flown that distance on the multicopter. And then someone had actually found the original video, and it was a 3D tour of Moscow, and they just in post done the movement, adding some motion blur and whatnot. So they sold a pretty good effect to fool some people. There were some bits and pieces that were obviously wrong once you started looking at it, but it just showed that a fake could just so easily dupe so many people.
First victim of war is truth. And here in New Zealand, our national broadcaster, the equivalent of the BBC, has just discovered that for many months now, someone in their editing department has been doctoring stories to make them pro-Russian. So all the wire stories that have come in have been altered and published, and now there's a huge fiasco because they are a source of disinformation, not objective news. It's so embarrassing. But that's war. Just everyone has their own spin on it. You can't believe anything. You've got to look at it all with a slightly jaundiced view.
And I think certainly, I think it's fair to say Ukraine's been using FPV stuff, and Russia's playing the catch-up game in that bit of propaganda. I think they're saying, no, we're using it as well. Look, we've got all of these.
Russia's got hypersonic FPV drones.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Would they see much? Would it be able to see anything if it's going that fast?
There's a lot of blue shift. There's a lot of blue shift. You have to adjust that.
But then I've seen it in Star Wars. It's just all the stars go past quickly. That's what happens, isn't it?
So that's light speed. That's slightly different.
No, that's when you have an airplane with a warped wing. Warp speed.
Warp speed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're definitely talking nonsense. Now, Think Flight, I've sent you an email. We must have you. We must have you on there. Just your amazing channel. And,
I'd like to thank Kevin from the FAA for turning up today. Kevin Morris for being a special guest star.
He accepted the link, but maybe it's a time zone thing. That'll be what it is. I'm sure that's what it is. He's in meetings.
He probably tuned in and saw me and thought, nah.
Absolutely. No, cool. I did send him previous videos and you were included. So yeah, maybe that is the case. Now we're definitely getting into talking nonsense. It's an hour and 25 and we've had electricity all this time. Hooray. What else have we seen this week before we go?
Got a quick one because it'll cover for people that were watching last week and wondering where the other Richard is, so Richard Ryan. Because we were mentioned last week that there's been a court case and it looks like it's going to make overflight by drone trespass in the UK. Now, I'm told that the judge hasn't ratified the case yet. That means there isn't a citation to quote. So it is coming out, but it's not one that you can go and view now to have a nosy yourself. So that's why Richard is on, because he's saying, well, I'll wait until it's there and it's published. And then he can come on the show and then he can chat about it properly. So that's what's going on there.
Welcome to our world. That's the situation in New Zealand where you have to have prior permission of any property you fly over.
That's one, Richard, of Altitude Angel, that you need to, if you haven't already been aware of, probably to keep an eye on to see what the consequences are of that and how robust it really is.
I shall watch intently.
And you did the SSSI, I just don't know how to say that, addition to
Triple SI.
Triple SI, that's it.
Yeah. We did, yeah, we added that.
What good's that? Why do I need that?
Well, because you guys asked for it. Well, maybe not you, because you don't have them in your wonderful part of Africa, but lots of UK drone pilots lobbied us for quite a while and said, it was, when we did this beta test, it's like, what else would you really like to see? And a surprising number of people said SSSI sites. So we said, okay, that's fine, we'll add them in. And there were some interesting LinkedIn discussions about, I think one member of the CAA even suggested, what does this do for advancing aviation safety? And we just kind of said, well, go away. Obviously, it makes sense, right? That not everything that is in the air is regulated by you, but it does affect other people. And not everyone that's flying wants to go and cause a whole bunch of nuisance to people or property of very special scientific interest or even nature. So just like we list over 70 different categories of ground, we call them ground hazards, but the reality is it could also be just areas you should really be aware of as a drone pilot. We just dumped those triple SI sites in there as well, and people by and large have really thanked us for that. No one has gone, why did you do that? Apart from some really outspoken people in certain regulatory positions.
Fair enough. Now,
one thing, Richard, which I might be putting you on the spot for, so you don't need to answer if you don't want. But I was just curious, because it's something that's obviously been sorted out by yourselves on Twitter in the past, but it was back in the days of Brendan and Adam being at DJI, which obviously they're not anymore. But we've had issues, and obviously we've seen a few news stories about it where we've got DJI pilots flying over Premiership grounds and that, and there was a problem where no one's really taken responsibility for flagging up. So as peak clubs are promoted and demoted and all this lot, there doesn't seem to be anyone that's allocated for putting all this data, keeping it up to date, and then DJI seem to be out of sync with your data. So I assume that there's some process where it's to be scraped or transferred across, and that's just not happening.
Yeah, we did. I think it got lost when we upgraded our website a little while back, but we had a whole public post up there to answer just that specific question. So if you, I know it's probably on something like waybackmachine.com. In fact, we need to go and see if it's there actually, because I don't even think we've got a copy of it anymore. But the general basis of it was, much to, I think, certainly there are some really good people, Christy and Brendan were all very much advocates for this, but they're part of a very large company, and I think DJI, I'm paraphrasing a little bit with some artistic license past the watershed, but I think DJI as a company kind of took the view that it wasn't really a safety system that they were building, right? Something like the map data that they put in their HUD, if you like, their ground station, was more about giving people information. A little bit like sat nav in your car doesn't apply the brakes if it sees that you're off the road. And that was always a little bit of a challenge for us, because we said, well, when people see, the wings on our logo, they kind of think that the data is going to be the best, right? It's going to be accurate, it's going to be real. And actually, although we supply, and still do actually, supply that accurate real-time data to DJI, there is a whole other process that they have where they process that down into some sort of global model. And then the update speed for that is really slow, right? So obviously anyone that's used Drone Safety Map or used the new Drone Assist, any of our tools will see every time you make a request, even if you move the map a little bit, it will say refreshing. And it's constantly connected to get the latest. Your DJI drone, your ground station controller, the Go app, doesn't do that, right? It's not constantly coming to AA for the data. It's going to its local storage of small selection of size. So I think they took probably quite a pragmatic view and just said, well, airports, probably a really bad thing for our company to be caught with drones flying in airports. And that's the kind of approach that they took at the time. But honestly, we were happy to supply them with that information, because I think the number one challenge that they were having at the time was they had a previous supplier that had a very American view of the world, and it just applied random no-fly zones of all sizes. It was like 5 miles around every airport everywhere in the world. And that cheesed, quite rightly, a lot of people off who were kind of like 4 miles from the airport and inside that zone and just couldn't fly. You spent $1,000, $1,500 on a drone and it didn't go anywhere. So they just wanted that support problem to go away. And lastly, I think on that question, we went through a process with DJI. Several other suppliers have done something similar, where they sort of say, how many prisons do you have in your data set? And we're like, well, you're asking really the wrong question, aren't you? We have the accurate, we have a set of prisons that are currently storing inmates or housing people, whereas, actually they were looking at counts of data sets from other suppliers and going, well, they've got 1,000 more than you. And they're like, well, yeah, they've gone on to the Ministry of Justice website for France and downloaded all of the legal offices associated with the processing, of the legal system in general. That's not where you deprive someone of their liberty or their freedom. That is what the regulation was. You can't fly over a prison, not you can't fly over a municipal building that houses someone that works in the prison sector. So, when you see stuff on our map, I just want you guys to know that we have really tried to get to the most accurate source we can as it applies in that territory. So yeah, whether it's triple SI or it's getting airport information or something which might seem quite mundane and easy, like prisons. But actually, again, you go back to the prison there. So even in here in the UK, in the early days, obviously that information isn't in an aeronautical information publication, right? What shape should be around a prison has only recently been started to be discussed. But when we did it, we got a CSV, a database of prison postal addresses, right? Which is not particularly useful. So I think it just highlights the problem, right? There's, towns, cities, governments are now having to think about the airspace and the things on the ground that affect flight above them that they've just never had to be involved in, and they're just not geared up for it.
No, it is a huge problem, and that's kind of your first mover advantage is you've been building your database for several years now. So it's kind of cool that you've got it, and we can trust it. We must welcome Kevin. We must welcome him. What a legend! What an absolute legend! Yeah.
How's my audio?
That's
How's the audio?
It's fine. It's fine. It's grand. It's grand. There's a particular FPV aircraft you're pretty famous for, but I'm not really into FPV. Perhaps you can remind me the name of that FPV aircraft.
I'm not sure. Probably the one most people are familiar with is the Nano Goblin. I don't know if people know that I did that, but
that's the one. Yeah. But your channel's full of some amazing projects, some really cool projects, and you explain things so well. I'm afraid I'm going to have to insult you a little bit now, or because you remind me a little bit of Bruce, and that's no honor.
That is an insult.
Oh yeah, that's an insult. That is definitely an insult. Yes,
I think it's a compliment.
The way you explain stuff, it just reminds me of that duffer from New Zealand. So no, there's really fantastic content, and I love the rubber band thing because it really. To me, it was basically every one of us used to save up for those things all around the world. Everyone saved up for those things, I would think. And that's where the journey into model aviation or real aviation or whatever form of aviation started for an awful lot of people, I should imagine. So that was a bob-on topic to pick and to do. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for that one.
Oh, no problem. It was fun.
So tell us what you meant about safety and regulation and all those other things you were referring to earlier in the comments.
Well, I mean, I just think safety is a good goal, but I think where I got my opinion from is probably listening to Mike Rowe, and he's, on their show when they were focusing on safety, that's when they started having accidents. And when they were focusing on competence, not only can you get cool things done, you're generally not having those accidents. So by just focusing on safety, you're not focusing on competence, you're focused on something bad not happening, and you shut down all the cool stuff that can happen because everything is now seen as a risk. And so where's the advances? It's like you're killing two birds with one stone by focusing on safety, like two birds that you don't want to kill. So that's my opinion on it. But, yeah.
You need to give him the red card for sensible thinking now as well, Bruce. It's just outrageous that you're allowed to come on and make sensible suggestions. But you're right. You get more about what you focus on, right? So if you focus on accidents, guess what?
Yeah.
Well, there's all the safety management systems that have become embedded in aviation and. What's it called? Human performance and limitations and stuff like that. And I think we might be overthinking some of that. But at the same time, I do think the drone industry is lacking some of that. But we might be overdoing it a little bit now.
Well,
as I've said, though,
go ahead.
Carry on. I was just going to say, too many people rely on the rules as a crutch and an excuse not to do things properly.
Well, that's that's basically what I was going to say. It's like if you're focusing on the results, there's been no deaths by drones except for, war zones, obviously. And it's so the safety is there. So why are we so obsessed with it? It makes no sense to me.
Well, but how do we? So do we need to show our workings, as Richard said earlier? How do we quantify that we're safe? How do we prove we're safe, other than the no deaths?
why do we have to prove we're safe? Like, I don't, until we cause problems, like, why are we being scrutinized like we're the bad guy? I mean, what, you know, and it's fine to be ahead of the curve. Like, I'm all for people thinking, you know, about potential situations and all that kind of stuff. But until we start going down that road, like, why turn the screws?
I definitely agree, but I think what's interesting about aviation regulation, internationally, before we get nationally, is that it is pretty much designed to stifle innovation, right? It's almost designed to push it out. You know, we don't. Change is not something which is well. There are processes for introducing change, etc. If you want to upgrade the bolts from steel to aluminium on a Boeing, then there's a process for that. But innovation is typically not the thing that you do through the regulatory framework. Whereas if you look at something like medical technology, arguably, I would say the risks for a vaccine manufacturer are probably massively bigger than Boeing, for instance. Boeing on its worst day is going to crash an aircraft and it's going to kill a lot of people. It's going to make a lot of people upset. But imagine Pfizer had got something tragically wrong with this new vaccine technology and wiped out hundreds of millions of people. Yet they're able to go and innovate within the regulations, push it through safety testing, save countless lives, probably by focusing more on that kind of competency-based approach. What can we achieve? How do we do it safely versus change is bad. It's definitely unsafe. This technology is terrible. We've got a whole bunch of preconceived notions about why we shouldn't do this thing. Therefore, no. And that's the default answer is just no, right? And it doesn't matter if it's here in the UK, US, EU. The answer is no from an aviation perspective. And that really surprises me. How did it get this safe? It didn't get safe by saying no to risk.
Yeah, the thing is that if you're going to take away freedoms from a community that's operating safely, you have to have just cause to do so. You must prove your case, which is risk assessments. We don't see them. You can't just come along and say, "Oh, you have to do this now," and we don't have to tell you why. What if? You can't do what ifs. You've got to give a independent, scientific, peer-reviewed risk assessment that supports the removal of the freedoms that these regulations are doing to the community.
So what is the group that is going to get together? Is AUVSI the group that's going to say, right, this is how it needs to be now? Is BMFA? What is the group? What is the group that is going to stand up and get it done? Start pointing at the regulator hard. Because that's what we're missing.
I think that there's a broader question, right? Is should the current aviation regulator be the quote unquote drone regulator, right?
Yes.
Because that part of certainly our UK CAA's job is to think about the market and the access to the market and the fairness of that that market to other entrants. And now you're asking the regulator potentially to also have a market understanding of a market which is moving on a completely different timescale to the one that they're used to, with completely different stakeholders, completely different customers, completely different internal government departments that need inputs. Like, are we just geared up for it? Do we need a new regulator or a new body, or not? Like, do we need one at all at this stage? There are rules, right, and everyone conforms to them, and the CAA don't actively go out and police every drone flight today, right? And yet there are very, very few incidents that occur. So clearly something is kind of working as it is right now from a regulatory perspective, i.e. don't change anything else, but maybe get a bit more permissive.
It also reflects on the intrinsically very low risk of what we do.
The thing I don't like as well is the narrative that's used is there are lots of accidents. People start reporting them, which is the other thing you use. It's just everything's in a negative, framed in a negative context. And the thing we don't look at is the accidents when you have with a drone, what you call an accident with a drone. It's not the kind of accident you have with an aircraft. If you get a drone, it bumps into a tree. Well, the tree's not getting harmed. It's the only thing that's getting harmed is the drone. You're going out and you're buying a new drone, and you're learning from that. But it's that kind of thing that it's like it's almost as though it's an aircraft that's crashed into it's crashed into a building that we've set it up that way. So. I mean, it's clear from the AIB reports that the reports, especially with commercial operators, which is where it's important, are getting done anyway. But I just fear that people will be in fear of reporting because it's been used negatively anyway. Because it's just saying we saw that anyway with Gary when the account was trying to be done and then inflated up and played about with to say drones are unsafe, and yet we saw that when it came to general aviation, you can get a pilot that's deliberately ignoring instructions as a crash covers it up. Other people involved in the cover up. And that's just let off. There's this kind of snobbery that if you're flying, a proper aircraft, you're of a higher standing of somebody that's got a drone business. The drones are just this little toy, and you're being a menace, and you're cutting all these
skin in the game.
Yes,
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, and it just isn't true, and it. We just got to get away from all this fear mongering.
Cool Cat says,
and I think. Sorry, just before I'll just finish. I'll let you jump in. I think that the point Richard was getting at that we've not really said so much, but I think there's a valid thing to it. Is there should be a regulator that's just for drones. That's maybe in a subset of the DFT or subset of the CAA, and that kind of model where they've got the expertise, they understand the software. With drones, really, the important things, the software, and understanding that from where they started to where they are now, to where they're going, that iteratively every month they're getting safer and safer and cleverer and cleverer. And it's all done through, if you take Autopilot, for example, it's all the learning. So something goes wrong, that feeds back in, that then makes the software better for everybody else. And that's again because there isn't finger pointing, none of that's misused. Oh, you've had a crash. We'll take those logs, we'll understand why it happened. Maybe it was your fault, maybe it wasn't, maybe there's something in the software that gets found out, it gets fixed, and it moves on. And we just need to be a bit more. I'm just puzzled why with drones it's this exception, and that's continued on, and it hasn't improved over time. If anything, it's getting worse.
Well, I was actually going to say kind of exactly the same thing because Cool Cat said non-compliance till there's a seat at a table. I think we've got to decide which table we're sitting at. I think as a community, it's not fit for purpose. And I suppose all modern digital things that rush in fast technologies, well, of course we've got to say, I can say it gives me an excuse to say AI again, doesn't it? Because that needs to be regulated and no one's doing anything about that really. That's not happening fast enough. It is all happening faster than the regulators can keep up. But people are beginning to leave because it's late. It is late. We've been going a while and we're so lucky to have Kevin here and him and Dan. The work they're doing, the sort of aeronautical engineering and the pushing of boundaries is so cool. And he's part of the sort of world that's going to bring us proper a kind of plans and things like that. Really cool stuff that can make a difference. I can immediately see those on Lake Victoria and the Great Lakes and doing good stuff and things like that. And the regulator needs to see these things are coming and change is happening. And yeah, I don't have an ending to that. So someone find an ending to that rant for me.
People like that are being marginalised. That whole sector of the community is being marginalised by overregulation. I mean, since I published my video yesterday, I've had probably no less than I'd say 80 emails from people saying it's got too tough. We're giving up with selling all our gear. We're getting out of the hobby. It's just we're not having fun anymore. We can't have fun. We're just regulated into the ground. And this is the problem. We have people that are innovative, and I love the content Kevin produces. It's really good. But it's going to be harder for him because all your stuff, because you put it on YouTube, you have to have a 107. So you can't build the real tiniest little drone and fly it outdoors because you can't get a remote ID broadcast module that small. So it's placing constraints on people that should be given more freedoms to enthuse the rest of the world to get involved in aviation, especially younger people. I just throw my hands up in despair that we're cutting off our nose to spite our face from the perspective of new blood coming into the aviation industry.
Definitely. Right. I think we better go. It's now 47. thank you very much for coming. I hope you come again, Kevin. We must have you here for longer. Divya, wherever you are in the world, look after yourselves. Be careful out there, and we'll see you again 2100 GMT next week. The bit where I forget to press the 2 buttons. There's 1, there's the 2. Cheers for now.